Halladay is one strike away. The 0-2. A bouncer. Ruiz. In time! Roy Halladay has thrown a no-hitter.
Okay, so, I mean, but just the way that the last play kind of transpired is this little fluky little nub off the plate, and Ruiz has to jump over the bat, and everyone's kind of looking at each other like, he just threw a no-hitter in a postseason game. It's unbelievable. The way that last ball came off the bat made it such an awkward ending to what was a special night. One of the best games that I had ever covered. Kevin Cooney, special to The Athletic, wrote a great piece about Roy Halladay. He covered him during his entire tenure with the Philadelphia Phillies, which Kevin, I know he was only here from 10 to 13, but the way he latched on to the fan base here, it would seem like he spent his whole career as a Philadelphia Philly.
Yeah, Mike, it was funny. I was looking at it last night, and what amazed me is you look at it. He spent 1/3 of the time that he spent in Toronto, but you looked at every picture that came out in the last 24 hours, and 85 to 90% of them were Phillies pictures. And you're talking about wire services and everything. That just showed that his main era, those 2 years, and not even the full 4, if you think about it, Mike. Because after 11, he had the injury issues. 12, he was okay, not great. It looked like he was a little worn out after what happened in 11. And then 13, obviously, was pretty much a lost year. To me, those 2 years are arguably the 2 best back-to-back years in Phillies history by a starting pitcher. Now, you can look at the Carlton 72 year, where he goes 27-10 and wins the Cy Young, and that's a great individual year. Then in 73, he followed up with something that was far less appealing. And even in those years between like 76 and 83, he was hit or miss per year. Those 2 years by Halladay in 10 and 11, I think, were the best ever by a Philly starter.
21 and 19 victories. Kevin Cooney, theathletic.com. Check out his piece there. Kevin, spring training. Give us because this is where he gets introduced, and his first time at spring training, 2010. Now, they had already won a series. They get back to the series. Controversial trading Lee in the offseason to get Halladay. But I thought Hamill said something yesterday. Yeah, we won the World Series. When they brought him in there, it changed the way that everybody on that staff prepared and got ready for seasons.
It did, because the workouts were legendary. You would get, as reporters, we would get there at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning at that point. Clubhouse doors would open at 7:30. Halladay had been there an hour and had pretty much finished his workout. And you would hear from people who did radio shows when they went down there about him running the steps as they were setting up their shows at 5 a.m. at the Tiki Bar. They would see Halladay running around. I mean, pretty much in total darkness. And you know this, Mike. I mean, their sun at that time of year in Clearwater doesn't usually come up till about 7. And he would be pretty much done his day. I mean, it was almost like a military precision with his workouts. And the thing that always got me about him too was he never verbally held people into task. He never took people and said, hey, you have to do this, you have to do that. But he almost made you feel ashamed if you didn't work nearly as hard. Nobody worked harder, but nearly as hard as he worked. And you could tell that the guys who flourished in that staff, who maybe did not have the most talent, I'll say, like a Kyle Kendrick, a Vance Worley, those kind of guys, Jay Happ, those guys were maximized for their frame. Now, Happ went on and was much better, down the road, but their early experiences were framed because they were around Halladay, and their preparation for everything, video, weights, everything, was almost identical to what Halladay did.
Kevin Cooney, theathletic.com. You can read his piece on covering Roy Halladay. Tell the listeners about the story, because everybody knew the 4 aces, but he was adamant that they included Joe Blanton in that mix.
Yeah, and it's funny, Ken Rosenthal also mentioned it on our site today too. The 4 aces were scheduled for their media tour in 2011. They were the biggest thing. It was like the Beatles at that point because of how Lee coming in. They had acquired Oswalt at the trade deadline in 10, and there was this impression that this was going to be perhaps the greatest four-man staff since the Orioles in the early 70s. And there was photo shoots for program covers and Sports Illustrated and ESPN interviews and press conferences. And Halladay came in and went, no, we're not doing this unless Blanton's involved. And so that's how the four aces. He goes, we're five aces here. All five of us are an ace on the day we pitch. Now that kind of shows how team oriented this guy was. And, it was funny hearing Cole Hamels talk about it yesterday. That translated beyond the field, that it was a sense of inclusion and that, we're all part of this special group to the point that a couple of years ago, four of the five, Roy Oswalt didn't make it, but four of the five ended up going on a vacation for 2 to 3 weeks over to Australia together with their families, and that everybody was kind of together and enjoying one another. They said Kendrick took the spot of Oswalt, which was appropriate because Kendrick usually took the spot of Oswalt when Oswalt got hurt in that year. It was just, to me, a sign of what he was, and he was going to mold that group into a unit together. And this is why this guy was one of the most popular among fellow players. Baseball players have egos, and you know this, Mike, maybe larger than any athlete's going, okay? And it's rare to hear them talk not differentiate, in praise of guys on other teams or anything. This guy had universal respect. And anywhere you go, any clubhouse you walked into, when you mentioned Halladay's name, it was almost like they would genuflect at this guy. That's because of his work ethic and the fact that he treated people the way they should be treated. And he was so focused on the game and what was right for the game.
Kevin, you mentioned Carlton earlier, and I think one of the things that makes Halladay just the story grows even more is because in 13 he wasn't very good. And, There's stories. I saw Michael Young tweet yesterday. He said, look, we're two guys. We're at the end of the line. I go to the mound. He's throwing 82 miles an hour. And he says to me, my whole body hurts. But he refused to come out of the game. But even with that, he knew at 13, I'm done. He didn't try to just keep latching on. I'm sure the Phillies might have brought him back. He probably could have made more money. But when it was done, that was it for him.
And think about it, Mike. He's one of those guys that if you went strictly by numbers, okay, he – fairly or not, is a borderline Hall of Famer, okay? That in a lot of people's minds, that he doesn't have all those gaudy, big, 250 wins and everything. He just got over 200. And look, I'm going to vote for him when he comes up next year. There's no doubt in my mind I would have voted for him no matter what happened here. But you're right. He could have latched on and tried to get 15, 20 more cheap wins to just keep the career going. But he knew the sense of walking away. And he also, I think it does kind of add to he wasn't in it for the money. He was in it to compete, and he was in it to try to win. The sad part is that baseball got robbed of seeing him pitch in the World Series. And obviously, I'm sure we're going to talk about, the only bad part about those 2 years in 10 and 11 is the fact that he was denied that opportunity because of circumstance, really.
Yeah, and yes, going down that road, I was at the Carpenter game where he just pitched. He pitched well, but Carpenter just pitched better, and it was a shame that the Phillies had all this pitching. The league game sticks out, obviously, but Howard, Utley, Rollins.
And Oswalt in Game 4, too. Oswalt got a lead in Game 4 and couldn't hold on to it.
Right, but Lee was
the Lee game is the big one.
Lee was, he
4-0, and you had the Cardinals on the road.
And as popular as Lee was, he was like, you could do no wrong, Lee, and I don't know that he ever really got the criticism for that game that maybe he deserved, but the fact that the offense in the end was always let them down, and that's why he couldn't get to that series.
And think about it, Mike. Think about that game, too, and I was talking about this with somebody else earlier today. No, there were multiple people in that game whose careers were never the same after that moment. Okay, involved.
Yeah, good point.
Halladay was never really the same after it. I know he was okay.
Yeah, because in 12 he was just okay.
He was okay, but his velocity dipped, and there were signs of trouble. If you remember that spring training, people were looking at the gun and talking about how much his velocity dipped at that point. Chris Carpenter was never the same after that game. He went on and pitched okay in the rest of the playoffs, and he had that one moment against the Nationals the following year in the division series. But he was never really the same. Obviously, Ryan Howard was never the same after that game because of the Achilles injury. Ruben Amaro was never the same, and the whole Phillies dynasty was never the same after that. That game, Black Friday always earned a special spot around here, like in infamy for what happened. To me, 2011 is way beyond that because if you look at Black Friday, well, the Phillies still went to the playoffs in '78, and they won the World Series in '80, and they went back again in '83. That was the end. That was the end of not just that team that year. That was the end of the era and a couple great careers. And Halladay, unfortunately, in a way, that was his last shot at winning a World Series, and that was his last really great, outstanding moment.
Kevin Cooney, theathletic.com, at Kevin Cooney. Check it out on Twitter and read the whole article about how Roy Halladay changed the Phillies' perception for those couple of years and more about his standout 2010 and 2011. It's a really good look. Kevin, we appreciate the time, pal.
No problem. Thanks, Mike.